At the age of 19, Edmond Dantes seemed to have the perfect life. He was about to become the captain of a ship, and he was engaged to a beautiful and kind young woman called Mercedes. And he was well liked by almost everyone who knew him. But this perfect life stirred up some jealousy, some dangerous jealousy, especially among some of Dantes' so-called friends, people very close to him, by the names of Danglars, Mondego, and Caderousse. These three friends got together and they drafted a letter accusing Dantes of treason. On the day of his wedding, Dantes was arrested for his alleged crimes and sent to the infamous Château d'If for life, where the most dangerous political prisoners were kept. While in prison, Dantes met Abbe Faria, an Italian priest and intellectual who had been jailed for his political views as well. And Faria taught Dantes history, science, philosophy, and languages, and turned him into a very well-educated man. Faria also bequeathed to Dantes a large treasure hidden on the island of Monte Cristo, and told him how to find it should he ever escape, which, I'm sorry, but spoiler alert, he did. He did escape. And so Dantes then traveled to Monte Cristo and found the enormous treasure. He considered his fortune and his treasure as a gift from God, given to him for the sole purpose of rewarding those who had done good to him. But more importantly, it was meant to help him punish those who had hurt him. Dantes disguised himself as an Italian priest, and he traveled back to Marseille, where he learned about the plot many years ago, 13 years ago, that had been devised to frame him. In addition, Dantes learned that his father had died of grief because of his absence, and that Mercedes, his fiancée, had been married to Mondego. Mondego, the person who betrayed him. But most frustrating of all of this, he learned that both Danglars and Mondego had become very rich and powerful and were happily living in Paris. What a story, right? I'm sure some of you might start recognizing it already. 10 years later, Dantes emerges in Rome, calling himself the Count of Monte Cristo. Does that ring a bell? Yes. Okay. He seems to be all-knowing and unstoppable. Dantes eventually inserts himself into the Parisian society, the high society, and none of his old cohorts recognize him because now he is the mysterious Count of Monte Cristo. He does not go by the name of Edmond Dantes, but Mercedes does recognize him. Dantes is able to insinuate himself effortlessly back into the lives of Danglars, Mondego, and Villefort, his three enemies. The 10 years that he had been missing after he got out of prison, he had gathered a lot of knowledge about them, damning knowledge, and he had set in his mind and planned for 10 years an elaborate scheme of revenge, which he now put into motion. The punishment for each of his enemies came slowly and in several stages. For those of you who have read the book, Alexandre Dumas's book, The Count of Monte Cristo, or who have watched the movie, The Count of Monte Cristo, will see that most of the movie or most of the end of the book is related to how Edmond Dantes is able to carry out these acts of vengeance. And once he's able to do that, then his mission is complete. And that's only then can he rest settled and can he be okay. Throughout his story, you can hear him saying, if you watch the movie or if you read the book, you can hear him say things like, "Don't rob me of my hate," when they're trying to stop this revenge plan. "Don't rob me of my hate, it's all I have." Or when he's talking about his enemies, he says, "Death is too good for them. They must suffer as I suffered. They must see their world, all they hold dear, ripped from them as it was ripped from me." He was obsessed with making others suffer, his enemies suffer. He was obsessed with the revenge and carrying out his revenge. And why? All because of a wound he had suffered. A wound, not a physical wound, although he did have many physical wounds in prison, but that wound of betrayal, that wound that ate him up inside for 23 years of planning his revenge. Is there a similar story in the Bible? A story that started off with betrayal? I mean, didn't start off, but there was a significant event marked by betrayal in a person's life. I'm not talking about Jesus, because yes, of course he was betrayed. Does anybody know? Joseph, yes. This is my all-time favorite story in the Bible. So it starts with betrayal, very similarly to Edmond Dantes, but it ends differently, right? Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob, but he was also spoiled, and he was always tattling. He was always telling on his brothers what mischief and what wrong things they were getting up to, although he did try to confront them too, but nobody likes to be told what to do, right? And so eventually that catches up with him, and he gets betrayed by those closest to him as well. His own flesh and blood, his older brothers. He's thrown into a pit. We all know the story. He's thrown into a pit. He's stripped of his distinctive robe, and he waits for death. He doesn't know what's going to happen to him. But instead, he was sold to a caravan on its way to Egypt. He was also sold as a slave. He was wrongly accused, thrown into prison. Can you see the parallels with the story of the Count of Monte Cristo? Thrown into prison. So Joseph knows about betrayal and injustice. He experiences them, and yet we don't hear of him planning and plotting that vengeance that consumed Edmond Dantes. He doesn't sit and meticulously plan his revenge on his brothers or on Potiphar's family or on anybody for that matter. His life took on a completely different path than he could have ever imagined. And so, what does this have to do with mental health, you ask? Well, let's try to unpack that. Both, in this month of mental health awareness, we're trying to bring awareness of how mental health is directly connected to our spirituality, to our relationship with God. And we're going to see now, by comparing Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes, and Joseph, how with the same wound that is inflicted on them, an emotional wound, a wound that affects their mental health, how it plays out differently. Because even though the wound wasn't their fault, they didn't ask to be betrayed. You know, they didn't look for that betrayal, but it's still their responsibility to see or to choose how to react to that same wound. You see, our woundedness is often the driving force between how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. Because as you can see, those are all connected. We can't separate our spiritual life from our thoughts, our emotions, and our behavior. They are all interconnected. And because they are all interconnected, it affects our relationship with God. So let's take a look at how those emotional wounds play out differently and how they drive different thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in these two characters. The betrayal in Edmond Dantes stirs up vengeance. That's the feeling. All the thoughts become consumed with vengeance, as does his behavior. In Joseph, even though it takes time, I don't think he did it right away, it stirs up forgiveness and kindness, and he pays it back at the end of his life towards his brothers and his father. In Edmond Dantes, when he comes out of prison, he takes 10 years of his life to think about how he can prove himself to others, to show that he's not that person, that prisoner that deserved that. Whereas Joseph took it differently. He said, how can I serve others in my position? He was in prison. How can I serve people in prison? He was in Potiphar's house. How can I serve people? He wasn't thinking about how can I make Potiphar's life miserable? How can I make him appreciate who I am? I am Joseph, the son of Jacob, a rich patriarch in Canaan. No. Whatever position he found himself in, he thought about how he could serve others. The betrayal stirred up intense feelings of hatred and cruelty in Edmond Dantes, and in Joseph, it stirred up love and compassion. In Edmond Dantes, it made him stop believing in God. In the conversation he has with the priest inside the prison, he says, I don't believe in God, he says to the priest, and the priest says, but God believes in you. It doesn't matter if you don't believe in him. God still believes in you. And that's what emotional wounds can do to us. They can stand in the way of our belief in God. In Joseph, he internalizes that God is with him, whatever circumstances he finds himself in, and he says, I can't let God down. I can't dishonor him. Everything that I do has to be in line with the God that I serve. So can you see the same wound, different effects on different people, depending on how you choose to react to that wound? I know that many people think that mental health is mostly related to anxiety and depression or some, really serious illness like schizophrenia or a personality disorder. But mental health is so much broader than that. And I want us to have more of an awareness about what that entails. Mental health is also the woundedness that each of us carries inside. The woundedness that impacts the way that we think, the way that we feel, and the way that we behave. And guess what? That includes in our church life as well. It's not only how we are out in the world. We bring our woundedness into the church as well. As Pastor Bob often says, this church is a hospital. We're all coming in here wounded. That's part of our mental health as well. So the question is, what does your woundedness look like? And how does it play out here in the church? And how does it play out in your everyday life? Your woundedness might not be betrayal or a life sentence in a prison, but each one of us has a story to tell that includes some form of woundedness. For you, it might have come in the form of rejection, or a divorce, or the death of a loved one, or maybe neglected as a child. Or maybe you were raised in a home where there was a lot of violence. Maybe your wound stems from racial discrimination. Maybe your wound stems from gender discrimination. Maybe your wound is trauma with a capital T. Or maybe it's trauma with a lowercase t. Those are still wounds. There's so many adverse childhood experiences that can create wounds in people. And the list goes on and on. I'm sure if we all look inside, you will be able to identify something. Our wounds can stand in the way of how we see God. Or actually, if we can see him at all. Dante's couldn't even see God. He couldn't even hear God. And it also impacts our ability to ask God for help. If you don't believe in God because of your wounds, how are you going to ask him for help? Our mental health, our emotional well-being is directly connected to our spirituality and our relationship with God. There's also something that I really, really want to clarify. Emotional wounds are not sin, okay? I'm going to repeat that again. Emotional wounds are not the same as sin. Of course, sin is part of our lives. We are born in a sinful world. We are raised in a sinful context. Our parents are sinful. Everything, about our existence here is sinful. But the wounds that are inflicted on us, emotional wounds, are not the same as sin. And we're going to look at that and why that is. So let's go back to this question. What does your woundedness look like? And how does it make you behave inside and outside your church? So maybe your wound doesn't manifest as revenge, but maybe your wound manifests as anxiety. And anxiety is, I know that it's a term that's thrown around a lot. Everybody says they have anxiety. There's different intensities of anxiety. But anxiety is basically the brain's inability to calm down. And if you think about how anxiety plays out in our everyday life, it's very difficult when you have, a lot of anxiety. It's very difficult to manage that anxiety. When we come into church, we bring that anxiety with us as well. If we're in doing our activities here in church, anxiety is there with us. And maybe, we feel guilty because the Bible says, do not worry, do not be anxious about anything. But we still feel anxious because our brain is unable to calm down. And that is not a sin. Maybe the origin of that is an emotional wound. Maybe you grew up in a context where there was so much stress and there was so much uncertainty or there was so much violence that your brain never really learned how to calm down. Your body never really learned how to calm down. And so the root of it is an emotional problem, not a spiritual one. Or maybe your wound shows up as anger. The Bible says you're allowed to feel anger, just don't sin in your anger. Okay? And, I've talked to many people who feel tremendously guilty about feeling angry with their families, or, I've had parents talk to me about how they feel so guilty when they yell at their kids, when they lose their temper, when, we're having worship and mom or dad has a temper tantrum or has anger come out in yelling, and we're just about to have worship. Is that a spiritual wound or is that an emotional wound? Maybe you grew up in a very angry, hostile environment. maybe you don't know what a calm, non-angry person looks like. Maybe you can see it, but you don't know how to do that. Again, because of certain emotional wounds related to anger in your personal story. Maybe you were traumatized by an angry parent. There's, and I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg here because we could delve into this a whole lot more. But maybe your wound looks like anger and it needs emotional healing. Obviously, spiritual healing is always necessary. But maybe the root is more an emotional issue than a spiritual issue. Maybe your wound comes out and is expressed in emotional eating. Maybe you eat your emotions. And I know that, the fruits of the Spirit is self-control, and every time that we feel that our eating is out of control, we feel guilty. By the way, you hear me saying the word guilty all the time? Guess what? There's research, and it's not recent research, it's pretty old, but I'm guessing it's very similar now. Adventists are known for experiencing a lot of guilt. Research shows that there's basically the two highest religions or people who practice a certain religion who experience the most guilt are Catholics and Adventists. Right? We're always dealing with guilt. So, again, we know the fruits of the Spirit says self-control, but maybe I can't control the way I eat because the only way that I feel good and I feel comforted is through food. And so I feel guilty all the time, or I'm always eating in hiding. Or, it could, I remember, this is a bit of a personal testimony, as a teenager, on the outside my life seemed perfectly fine, but on the inside I was a wreck. I hated my school, I hated my parents, I hated my house, I hated my teachers, I hated everybody. On the outside, I was a very well-adjusted teenager, but I struggled with emotional eating for many years, and the guilt was overwhelming. Now, as an adult, I realize, okay, I know why I would turn to food for comfort and for trying to feel better, because there was a lot of things going on. There was a lot of problems at home. And trying to cope with that was through food. So maybe our wound comes out through emotional eating. Maybe our emotional wound comes out in perfectionism. Can you imagine cutting the grass like that? It would drive me crazy. But how is perfectionism, I'm not saying that it's always, but many times perfectionism is the result of a wound, the result of never feeling good enough, the result of no matter how hard I try, I can never please my father or my mother or my boss or my spouse, so I'm a perfectionist. And that's how the wound plays out. One more wound. There's many more. I could sit here, for hours, but we're not going to go into all the wounds. Another wound, workaholism. The more I work, the more God is going to approve of me, because I need approval, because I need acknowledgement, because that's my wound. Okay? So you probably heard me saying that oftentimes these wounds are related to our past or experiences that we've had in life that impact the way that we think, feel, and behave. And we're not looking, the whole point of this is not to look for somebody to blame. Oh, my parents were like this. Oh, my boss was like that. Oh, my spouse did this to me. So I'm wounded and I'm going to, walk around blaming them and I can't change myself because it's their fault. No, that's not the whole point. As you can see with the story of Joseph and the Count of Monte Cristo, they had people to blame for being betrayed. And Edmond Dantes chose to focus on those people and blaming them. But Joseph's life was so much more rewarded, so much more blessed, because he chose a different path. It's not focusing on who can I blame for my emotional woundedness. So, what can we do as Christians? What do we do with this woundedness? Do we walk around bleeding emotionally everywhere? No, the whole point in bringing awareness to this mental health situations or dimension of our life is to be able to address it, heal those wounds, and also in that healing being able to connect more in our relationship to God. So, what are some of the things that a Christian can do? Number 1, be curious. When somebody says to you, "You look angry," or "Why are you always yelling?" Or if in a board meeting, you always have a short fuse and you're angry, or in Sabbath school, or in, whatever situation, you notice that you have a repetitive behavior or a repetitive reaction, start being curious about it. Okay? None of us like to be confronted with ugly truths. Okay? We don't like to look inward. We always try to look outward, defend ourselves. But if we have an attitude of introspection constantly, then we can have the opportunity at least to think about it and maybe even to change. I like what Psalms 139, verse 23 and 24 says. I invite you to look that verse up with me. Psalms 139, verse 23 and 24. Psalms 139, verse 23 and 24. David says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." This is being curious about what's going on. Why am I behaving this way? Why do I always react this way? Why do I always think this way? Why do people accuse me of being a certain way? I don't see it, but people are saying it about me, so search me, O God. Make me curious about what I can do about this. Search me, O God, know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Ask God to reveal to you what you need to change, what you need to pray for. Ask Him for insight into what's going on inside. Number 2, awareness. You can't change something that you don't know is there, right? You need to have awareness. I always say, my husband always teases me. He says, when I point things out to him very kindly, he says, "Oh, thank you for the diagnosis." Now I know what's wrong with me. Now I have a label, he says. Anyway, so the whole point of that is that you can't change what you don't know. So you have to have awareness in order to want to do something about it, right? So awareness. Obviously, all this is done through prayer, but also lean on people around you who love you, who you trust, to help you create some of that awareness. Don't be defensive, be curious. Ask for that awareness. And then take small steps to change. So, going to the emotional wound that comes out as anger, knowing, let's say I know I struggle with anger, then maybe one small step could be, if I know that I have a short fuse at a certain time at the end of the day, then maybe one small step to change that would be to set up the routine at home differently. Or maybe in that particular time when I know I'm going to have a short fuse, maybe remove myself from the situation, take a moment to pray, to beg God for help for that situation that you're going to go into. It's one small step. Doesn't mean you've gotten rid of your anger, but it's one small step. Another step, and by the way, this is not the only things that you can do. There's so much more. Obviously, I don't want to dismiss or minimize any of the other options and resources that we as Christians have. Obviously, your relationship with God needs to be a priority in order to be able to do these things as well. Continuously praying. There's lots of things that you can do. But in addition to try to look at our emotional wounds, these are some of the tips that can help us get to those wounds. Once we have that awareness and we know what's going on, we know what we need to address, and we started taking small steps to change, I really encourage you to engage in Christian meditation. And I know a lot of people, get very scared when they see this word meditation. So let me say something about Christian meditation. Christian meditation has been around for thousands of years, okay? If you look at the book of Psalms, you will read about King David meditating on God, on his love, on what God does for him, on his goodness, on his mercy, endlessly. There are hundreds of examples in the book of Psalms. So if we, as well as Ellen White says that we should meditate on the cross of Christ every day and on his sacrifice for us. Those are all called Christian meditations. I know that in our mind we might associate meditation with Eastern religions or something taking over our minds. But let me talk to you about the research and what the research says about Christian meditation compared to non-Christian meditation. The research shows that when people meditate on words related to their religion or their faith, like love, peace, patience, the fruit of the Spirit, those kinds of things related to their faith, it has a much better result than people who meditate on random things. Okay? So I want you to know that this is backed up also. There's a difference. Christian meditation makes a difference in our brains because we are meditating on Christ, on his love, on his goodness, on his mercy. It really helps manage our brains differently. Okay? This is also, I want you to understand how important this is, and not be afraid to engage in Christian meditation because it's so useful. There's actually an app. I don't know if you've heard of Abide. It's a Christian meditation app. I tried it out. I wouldn't talk to you about something that I haven't tried. I tried it out. I put it on before I before going to bed, and I put it on, and let me tell you, the peace and the goodness and the well-being that I felt was life-changing. It really helped me fall asleep in such a gentle, peaceful way. And it was all related to God, his goodness, his love, his mercy. If we meditate on these things, how do you think it won't have an impact on our emotional wounds? And then one last point, if you feel that you need that additional help, get some professional help. Go to somebody that you trust. Maybe talk to a trusted friend, somebody who you see as wiser than you. Maybe you want to talk to your pastor. Maybe you want to go talk to a counselor. Maybe you want to talk to an elder in the church. But get help. So what is your woundedness? Mental health for a Christian is a key aspect to our relationship with God. Can you see that even God can take our woundedness and bring us closer to Him through our woundedness? We have opportunities like today to reflect on how to improve our mental health. God doesn't take away all our suffering. He doesn't take away our problems. He doesn't promise us that He will give us problem-free lives, but He gives us the resources to be able to overcome psychological obstacles that stand in the way of us having a close and intimate relationship with our Heavenly Father. In closing, I'd like you to turn with me to John 10, verse 10. Maybe you know it by heart. It's a very well-known verse. Jesus says in John 10, verse 10, "The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy." That's what wounds do. They steal, they kill, and they destroy us. That's what our enemy, that's what Satan wants to do to us. But Jesus says, "I have come that they may have life and that they might have it more abundantly." And that's what Jesus invites us to do. So let's start doing our part in taking care of our mental health in order to experience that life more abundantly. May God bless you.